Hello and welcome to the session on creating and quality assuring online learning materials. This is the summary of a session that was held in June 2021. My name is Adriaanse and I'm an associate of HOLEX. HOLEX is the organisation that supports adult and community learning providers. And this particular project, the Digital ACE project, was started in June 2020, so a year ago from this recording, and it was funded by the UFI VOC Trust and managed by HOLEX. So this particular session is part of the project. Let me explain. So as you'll see, the project was designed to support adult community learning providers as they as they were working towards developing materials for their online learning. So in June 2020, a lot of the community learning providers and all other providers worked really hard and in many cases very successfully to develop, to go from face-to-face training to online as we were all put in lockdown. So the HOLEX quite rightly realised that perhaps some providers needed additional support and materials to be able to help them on that journey. And so they started the Digital ACE project. On the HOLEX website that you'll see there, you will find a lot of materials, guidance and resources on developing underpinning technology, on developing resources, policy, safeguarding, on how to support low-level learners and how to quality assure online provision. So they're all available on the website at holex.org.uk/digital ACE/ and that should give you the information. I do recommend them, but I hope you'll find them helpful. So let's move on to this particular session. So this was a session, as I said, that was held in June 2021, so a year on from the days when online learning really took off. We held this session with about 16 colleagues from adult community learning providers to help develop top tips on creating online learning materials and activities for tutors and managers to use, and particularly also developing criteria for quality assuring those online learning materials and activities by managers and tutors, especially with peer tutor observations. So what the outcomes are for you as now participants of this recorded session is that we hope that by the end you will have developed your repertoire of approaches to and top tips for creating online materials, particularly through collaboration with colleagues, and a summary of online assessment practices, and to have a clear criteria for quality assuring online learning materials for tutors and managers. So we're now going to move on to developing top tips for creating online materials and indeed online activities. So the first thing I did was an activity. I showed them, I wanted them to look at some learning materials, which included a video. And so this was a task that I asked them to do. I wanted them to review the materials as managers or peer tutors. I wanted to think about what works, what the gaps are, where the pitfalls are, and what could be improved. And then I want them to use their discussions to identify tips and advice on creating materials. As this was an online activity where they go in their breakout rooms, then I gave them some guidance. So two aspects of this guidance. One was to make sure that they nominated somebody to present their views. So that was how I want them to manage their feedback to the whole group at the end of the breakout activity. And I also wanted them to take a photo of this slide and the next one so that they would know actually what they had to do. So there are a couple of tips already. I hope on when you're developing activities, make sure that when you put people into breakout rooms that they really do know what they need to do. So here is a session for the learning activity for ESOL learners, entry level 2. So quite a low level. Some of the learners will certainly have quite a lot of vocabulary, but they might not necessarily be active, be accurate rather in that vocabulary. So the aim of the session was particularly focusing on understanding and giving instructions. So the learners would be watching the same video, which I will show to you 3 times. So the first time they've got a question about the question is what is being made. I can tell you it's an omelette, but they need to work that out. It shouldn't be difficult for them. And then I also want them to make a list of the ingredients. Hope certainly they could write it down, but I certainly want them to see if they could remember the ingredients in their head as well. The second time they watch the video, they would have to watch it and read it, but not write this time, because the focus really is not on them reading what they've written, because you don't often do that if you're telling people how to do something. So I wanted them to try and work out for themselves as they were watching the video how many stages there were, but particularly the instruction word for each stage. So this is a vocabulary and grammar, so they needed to look out for and be able to recognize what the instruction word is, because by knowing what the instruction word is, then that will help them to be able to give instructions in the future. And the third time, then, I'd want them to actually say the instructions in their head, so they need to be able to go through them in their mind. They don't hear the words, as you'll see, they can read them. So this is being able to go from the passive reader to an active speaker. So then I'd want them to then go into breakout rooms to tell each other their the instructions, so they can then practice it. And I would listen to the go into the breakout rooms and see how they were doing, so I could assess their progress as well. Right, so I will now show you the video. So you might, as I want to take a snapshot of that, a screenshot rather of that, or a photo, so that you have that information as well. Right, I will now play the video for you. Right, now let's go back to the slides. Okay. So I'll now go through what the feedback from the group. So what worked well, they thought it was a nice pace, they thought it was a clear video, and they felt it was good to have simple preset tasks for the learners, particularly as they go through each of the viewing. The pitfalls, the gaps and suggestions, they need to make it clear that the learners will watch the video 3 times with a more challenging task each time. Some people felt that the video might be too long, that it was just under 3 minutes. So that's something that you might want to decide. I absolutely agree that the writing was too quick, but again, the tutor could pause the video to make sure that they have time to read it. And and then the suggestions was perhaps learners could put their answers in the chat, or perhaps use a poll or a gap fill exercise to be able to assess how well they managed to do each task. So the teacher can then can assess whether they've got the vocabulary, whether they've got the grammar, and how well that they are remembering the information. So so that was the critique, and then we use that to develop some tips. Before I do, just let me say that all I did was Google how to make an omelette, and I felt that was an appropriate video. There was another one with speaking, which might be something that you could use later. But so we are very lucky now that there are an enormous amount of materials that we can use for online learning. We just need to make sure that we're using the materials appropriately so that the learners get the best out of it. So that's why these are the tips for creating online materials and activities. Check that the technology works by setting up a trial session with a friend, and I certainly did that with somebody, so to make sure the first time they couldn't see the video, and the second time they could. The first time I made this recording, I couldn't, you wouldn't have been able to see the video, so I'm doing it again. So we need to always check. Remember that some learners will be using their phones, which is important. And really important tip, make sure that the learning outcomes are clear from every learning material and activities, clear for you and also clear for the learners, so you know why you're doing it and they know why they're doing it. Check how the materials come across for the learners, that you need to view them quite critically. Are they too complex? Are they too long? Are they helpful? Or are they too simple? And then something that we will do for the, later on in the session is check how you'll assess the learning. Really important. It's all very well having learning materials, but every learning material is to help learners learn. Therefore, you as a tutor need to be able to assess their learn. Really an important tip, a lovely tip that came from somebody in the group, is break up each task into manageable chunks, because you must remember that everything takes longer online. Check the level of vocabulary that I've already indicated as well, that we are very good at using jargon, and it might be that that learners will struggle to use it. Make sure that the task is set beforehand, sorry, the task is clear, and it might be useful to send it beforehand. So this is called flipped learning. So it might be helpful that if there's a task or the materials that you want them to use, you send it before the session, and then the session time is actually much more productive. And make sure the learners know how to use the breakout rooms and the chat. Particularly in the breakout rooms, there's facilities for like a whiteboard, call for help, etc. So and there might be messages that they need to look out for from the tutor. So you might need to set up a separate session for this and have a checklist so that you know which of your learners do know how to use breakout rooms and which ones may need more support. So that was some tips, and now I'm going to go into what makes an effective learning activity. So I've done a flow chart really here, which I've developed about the learning process for learners, and I'm going to use my omelette again. So that's session for ESOL learners at level 2. that entry level 2 rather, so you need a learning goal. So the learning goal for that activity and probably for that session and a couple of other sessions would be for the learners that I want to be able to understand and give instructions. That started off with a very simple recipe, but it can go to all sorts of different instructions. Then you need the learning components, which is what's needed. So you break down that learning goal into learning components. So they need to learn the nouns and the verb forms. They need the prepositions, they need the intonation, and they need to put everything in the right order. So that's where they need to be able to know and understand and follow the instructions. So they need the vocabulary, and then they need to have the right grammar and the pronunciation so that they can actually give the instructions so that people can understand them. So then assessment criteria is being able to use the vocabulary and the grammar independently. And how will they know this? So this is where, again, that you would break down that vocabulary into the ingredients in this case, and the grammar would be into using instructions, which would be the imperative form. They need to know, not necessarily know it's the imperative form, but they need to be able to know how to use it. And then the final part of the learning process is reinforcing it. Understanding and giving instructions for other recipes would be an example. Then you might move on to directions, because that's another way of understanding and giving instructions. And they might be giving instructions to children, it might be at work. And generally the grammar is the same because you're using the imperative form, but obviously the vocabulary will be different. So that's the learning process for learners. So I'm now going to go through some assessment practices. So if you've got that process, the important part of it is actually the assessment. The are 9 that I've picked out, which I hope you'll find helpful, and I'll give you some tips for each one. So the questioning to challenge and assess learners' understanding is challenging online. And even face-to-face, because even with targeting individual learners, obviously depending on the size of the group, but it would take ages for the tutor to assess if everyone has grasped the knowledge. Particularly online, you could use a chat, so the more of them have to come in at once, or you could use a poll or a quiz such as Kahoots. There's a really good advantage of using the chat is that you can save it, and then you can review that at the end as a tutor and analyze who wrote what and who didn't respond. This will then help you differentiate activities for the next session. Similarly, as I've visited classes and observed classes, I've seen in face-to-face classes that tutors using mini whiteboards. And online, I've seen people use Padlets and Jamboards that have been helpful as well. So the next one is written activities and worksheets, where you might, for the omelette, have matched the pictures of the ingredients with the words on the worksheet. I think the issue I have with this is that you may just be testing if they can complete the worksheet, the exercise, or if it's a maths, the calculation. You're not really checking that all learners have learned all the words, all the grammar, so they can remember it. So again, like the whiteboards or chat may be a better way than using worksheets. Problem solving or discussions in groups or pairs, where they have to come up with a solution or they come up with their views. They generally work very well using breakout rooms. You can appoint learners to roles, and by doing this, you can differentiate the activity by making it more or less challenging for specific learners. It's a useful tip to let the learners have the materials beforehand. Again, this is called flipped learning. If they are familiar with the materials, the session time is more productive. But of course, you need to make sure that they are committed to doing that, their pre-session activity or pre-session homework. If you do want them to go into an activity cold, so to speak, please give them time to read or become familiar with the materials, so so they have time to understand the materials as well as then use them for the problem solving or discussion. Often activities in breakout rooms will lead to presentations by learners individually or in groups. and the tutors and learners assess and feedback how well the learners are meeting the assessment criteria. So that's why it's really important they do have that success criteria. Another tip for this is recording the presentations. You will need the learner's permission, of course, but this will really enable you to make a more detailed assessment later, so then you can give that more detailed feedback to individuals, either by email or through separate meetings, through separate online meetings. The role play is where learners can practice or carry out an activity. Breakout rooms again works very, very well. You visit you as a tutor, you can visit the groups, you can observe, you can give prompts and feedback, and then again you can also take notes for you. And again, by recording the presentations, that will help you assess in more depth later. Moving on to the case studies, very similar to discussions. They review a case study to identify problems and offer solutions. You can do it in breakout rooms, and they have a case study where they need to offer solutions to a given scenario, and flipped learning really will make that time in the breakout rooms much more productive if they know the information. You might even give them a task where they have to look something up and bring something to that discussion. They might each have a different topic to look at. Quizzes, I've talked, they really do work well, and you can, what I've seen tutors do is that they design the questions and the multiple choices for the answers. But my tip for this one really is that this is more than a right or wrong answer quiz. It really needs to be seen as an assessment. So you need to check which learners get the answers right, of course, but also which ones get it wrong and what they said, so that you can follow this up later. So that it's important that you that the learners aren't just seeing how many ticks they get or where they are on the scale, but certainly so that they get feedback that they got the answers right, or how they get supported if they need to revisit something so that they understand the concept or the information correctly. Assessing craft and practical skills is online is difficult. I know it can work well by using second cameras and things where you can people can video themselves doing something, but you might not be able to see the learners carry out the practical work. They could do this beforehand, and that has worked. And then they send you the photo of the cake that they've iced, or the quilt that they've made, or the painting, or the woodwork, etc. Right, so I've got some golden rules for you. The golden rule really is, number one, is that you must plan. In fact, there's only one golden rule. The golden rule simply is that you must plan your assessments. So I've put that into 4 steps. First of all, identify which assessment activity you will use for which assessment criteria. So that when you start with your learning, you've got your learning goals, then you break your learning goals down into components that I showed you, and then you need to decide how am I going to assess each one. So your components are the assessment criteria. So then this will help you decide which is the best assessment methodology, and I gave you some different assessment practices earlier on in the video. Step 2 is tell your learners what the assessment criteria are. This will help them assess their own performance, as well as know how you are going to assess them. Please make sure you don't use too much jargon. We do slip into this very easily indeed, I know. Step 3, always use the assessment criteria to give feedback to the group and or individuals. Ask them how they think they have met the criteria. And step 4 is to make giving feedback a two-way process in the same way, really, between you and your learners. So you ask them how well they think they have done, and then really important, you ask them how they will remember what they have learnt. I'm sure you will be very familiar with the Ofsted's inspection, education inspection framework, has quite a lot under implementation and impact about long-term learning, long-term memory. And so this is why it's really important and useful for learners to work out how they are going to remember what they've learned. And that's useful for you as well, if they tell you this, so that you know what strategies they use, so you can build on them and use on them on later. We all have different ways of remembering things. I mean, if I ask you how you remember how many C's and S's there are in the word necessary, I'm sure that the group of us would all come up with different ways of doing that. So that's why sort of strategies for remembering things are really important, and you need to help your learners build those up so they do remember things long term. So the next activity was for them to identify the criteria, so the quality assurance criteria. So we've now talked about developing them and using the materials and assessing the learning. Now we're talking about visiting classes, either as a manager or a peer tutor, to be able to quality assure the impact of the quality and the impact of those learning activities and materials. So I've ask them to think about the slides and the Coventry example and this one, and to consider what good practice looks like for online assessment practices and activities, and then to use their answers to identify quality criteria for quality assuring online activities and materials. What do you look for? And then again, I ask them to nominate a spokesman. So this is what they came up with. So there's the first of two slides. So this is for you to think about when you are observing other people teaching, that you need to think about how well do the materials and activities relate to online learning objectives. Has the tutor broken down the learning objectives into skills and knowledge, i.e. the assessment criteria? And then you might want to think about to what extent is the activity appropriate for those actual learning objectives and indeed the assessment criteria. So is that activity going to help the learners achieve those learning objectives? Has the tutor planned the outcomes for each activity? And do they know and let the learners know this? So this is what the activity is, and this is what you'll be learning from it. Do the learners know what the learning objectives are and how they will be assessed? So yes, so building on from the next one, so do they know the activity? Do they know what they'll learn from it? And do they know how they will be assessed? And as important, how they'll be able to assess their own learning? And are all learners clear about each activity and what they need to do? So that's something that you might want to check, and then certainly ask the tutor how and work out how the tutor makes sure of this before they actually go and do that activity. The next one, next set of quality assurance criteria is the evidence. Is there evidence that the tutors can see that the learning is taking place by all learners? Do you remember I said that if they ask questions to the whole group and a few answer, that's not necessarily going to give the tutor, well, they won't give the tutor knowledge that all learners are learning, especially as perhaps some of them might have their cameras off or they might be on the phone. So the tutor needs to think how else he or she can make sure that they are assessing that learning is taking place by all learners. And is time, look at the lesson plan and the lesson is appropriate, is enough time given to measure learning. What's really useful, if you want to find this out and you're observing a session, you might want to split the time. So you might want to go in at the beginning, you might want to look at the session plan and see or talk to the tutor, when are you going to explain the activity and when are you going to assess it, so that you might then want to join at a later time. And then I think it's also important as you're thinking about the feedback you're going to give the tutor, that you need to collaborate before the session as well. Tell me how this is going to work, or tell me how you think it works, rather than just making judgments on your own. So you've got the tutor's point of view as well. I'm sure this is practice that you all know when you are observing, is to provide timely feedback. It's very easy when you're being observed to forget when the observer was actually in the room or listening in. So it's making sure that you give feedback so it's still fresh in everybody's mind. And then in practical sessions, a tip here, do all learners know how the tutor will be assessing their work before they do it? And then in the dance and the practical physical sessions, Tai Chi, Pilates, etc., can the tutor see the learners carrying out the activities? Are they not just demonstrating it? And I gave you a tip about that earlier on. So that's the reviewing the session, and this is where we then agreed what to pass on to the sector. So what I would include in this video. So so there are two sets of slides. You've just seen the first two, which is about the criteria. So I haven't changed those, and now these are the tips. So you've got the tips for criteria for creating online learning. Check that the technology works by setting up a trial session. Make sure the actives work for people joining by phone. If you're using a video clip, you might want to send it to them or other information in advance. So use flipped learning. And I know that Holix has also got a session on flipped learning that's recorded that you might like to use as well. Make sure that the learning outcomes are clear for all your learners. You might need to check that they really are clear. Check the level of vocabulary. Use terminology your learners will need in the future, and not just teachers' jargon. So the words that they will need for work and for their future learning, other type of vocabulary that they will need, and not just what you use as a teacher. Particularly example, I think, is of names of tenses and things. They might need to know some words for exams as well, so you might want to consider that too. And then you check how materials come across for the learners from their point of view, and how you will assess learning, each learning activity online. Then make sure your learners know what success looks like. So they've got the criteria. Break up each task into manageable chunks. Remember that everything takes longer online. And if you're using chat, then it's really useful to record it. Same if you're recording an activity, so that you can analyze it later. And then allocate learners to different breakout rooms is really a good way of differentiating an activity. And you can appoint a spokesperson for each group, or specific roles, which is another way of differentiating. And then make sure that your learners really do know how to use different facilities online and including in the breakout rooms, and have a separate session. So I've repeated the ones I did earlier, but I've added a few, and hopefully those are clearer for you now. So that really is the end of the session. That the intended outcome for you is that you've developed your repertoire of approaches to top tips, as I've just gone through. You've got a summary of online assessment practices. I gave you a list of those that you have in this video, and I went through with some tips for each one. And then you've got some clear criteria for quality assuring online materials as well. So that's the end of the session. Can I thank you for participating and bearing with me through this recording, through this video, and I wish you all well in your online learning activities. Thank you very much indeed.